Welcome to iAdvocate, a podcast series on the public policy process developed by the Emergency Medical Services for Children National Resource Center. In this video supplement, you will hear from Clare Kelly, Executive Director of Government and External Affairs, and Tim Jones, Director of State Government Affairs at Children's National Medical Center. They will share their opinions and advice on engaging policymakers, the difference between the federal and state legislative process, and the difference between federal and state legislative procedures. What are some important distinctions between Congress and state legislatures?
I would say that, first of all, Congress has a much broader scope of responsibilities than state legislatures do. The Congress is responsible for the entire country, and state legislatures are responsible for what goes on in their border only. The setup is essentially the same. All but one state legislature has two branches. Nebraska has a unicameral legislature, meaning they only have one chamber. But much like Congress, the states have a House and a Senate, and they have senators who represent a broader part of the state, and delegates or representatives who have a smaller constituency. So another distinction is also that members of Congress have much bigger constituencies. They have much broader scope of responsibilities in terms of the issues that they have to be responsible for, from foreign affairs to tax matters and finance to healthcare and defense. Whereas within the state, it's a smaller number of issues that they have to deal with, but it's still pretty intense, and they also meet for a shorter period of time generally. Every state is a little different. Some states meet year-round, their legislatures do. Others only meet for, say, January to April or May. And Congress meets all year-round as well in a 2-year session.
I would add that state legislatures usually address issues that are very local in nature, so things that would affect you on a daily basis, as opposed to Congress, addressing, more broad policy issues that would be most likely carried out in the states.
Are there differences in the roles and responsibilities between the two?
I would say that in both roles, legislators have pretty similar roles. They're obviously representatives of people, of their constituencies, and therefore are voting on matters and addressing matters that are hopefully in the best interest of their constituencies. State legislators, do represent a smaller amount of constituents, so they are a little more accessible than the federal legislators. But I would also say that that both do their best to offer a lot of different ways to be accessible, either through verbal face-to-face ways or in electronic means.
Are there differences in legislative authority between the two?
Yes, the Constitution lays out the powers that the federal government is responsible for, and those powers that aren't given to the federal government in the Constitution are deemed the responsibility of the state. It's a federalist. The Constitution sets up a federalist style of government, so it's a power sharing, as opposed to, if you look at, say, Great Britain, that's a singular power government. It's very centralized. So the federal government, or the Congress, along with the executive branch, are responsible for things like interstate commerce, national defense, declaring war, things like that. The states, however, have the responsibility for intrastate commerce. And then an example of a power sharing is, say, transportation, building interstate highways. So there is a difference in the issues that they have to address.
Why is it important to engage policymakers at both the state and federal levels?
Because the states and federal government do have differences in their jurisdictions. So where the federal government might have jurisdiction over another, that obviously means that you should engage those policymakers on those decisions. But the states might have a little different jurisdiction, and they might have different nuances in some of the things that they may be overseeing, even though it might be generally the same issue. So it's important to engage both the federal and your state legislators, because you want to make sure you cover the breadth of a particular issue.
When is it better to engage one versus the other?
Well, it depends on where the issue that you're concerned about rests. So if it's a federal issue, if it's a bill before the U.S. Congress, you want to engage your federal policymakers. If it's an issue that's before your state legislature, you're going to engage your state legislators, your representatives who represent you in your district and the surrounding districts. There is some crossover. The Medicaid program, for example, is a program that is shared by the states and the federal government. It's jointly financed. So when Congress is making decisions about federal Medicaid policy, you might want to work with your local legislators as well, keeping them informed about your concerns, because every state is small, relatively small, and the legislators know each other. So the members of Congress know the state representatives, and they have conversations. So if the state representatives have some concerns about the way a federal policy is going to impact the state, that dialogue needs to occur, and you need to be having conversations with both of them.
Has a state law ever advanced to become a federal law?
Absolutely. The best example of this is probably healthcare reform. Massachusetts was one of the first to enact health reform, and then the federal government enacted its own health reform last year. There might have been instances where the federal healthcare reform included provisions that might be different from what the Massachusetts state law might have said. So in those cases, the supremacy clause comes into play, where the federal law supersedes a similar state law that might have been passed. So there are cases where there might be, a piece of state legislation that's passed, and then where the federal government comes in and passes a similar piece of legislation, they will be the ones ultimately that will have to be followed by each state.
Since each state's legislature and legislative process is unique, how can I find out about a given state?
The best advice to learn about your state is to use the internet. Each state has their own websites, not only for their governor's website, but also for their state legislature's website. If you go to those, and it's very easy to do by just searching the internet, each state's website is similar in that they contain bills that are being considered, where they are in the legislative process. Also contains legislator contact information, including phone numbers and email addresses. So it really is a one-stop shop in terms of the General Assemblies in each state to be able to tell you how to follow their activities, as well as contacting your legislators.
What are staff roles and responsibilities in legislative offices? Are they different between federal and state legislatures?
They have similarities. Again, at the federal level, they're going to have broader responsibilities than at the state level. Let's talk about Congress first. They have more staff than state legislators do. They could, in the House of Representatives, they may have 5 or 6 members of their staff who answer letters. Those are called legislative correspondents. So they respond to constituent letters. You have legislative assistants, LAs is what they're called by shorthand, legislative assistants, and they're given a certain number of policy issues that they're responsible for. So one LA might have responsibility for health care and tax. Those are 2 huge issues. Another LA might have responsibility for agriculture and foreign affairs. So they have their own portfolio of responsibilities. If you go down to the state level, they may, a state legislator may have 1, or if they're in a leadership position, maybe 2 members of their staff. And so those staff members are handling all constituent correspondence, and usually the schedule for the member of the legislature. So it's smaller, but it's fast-paced at the state level. At the federal level, it's a little bit bigger, a little bit slower paced.
I would also mention one of the key differences between staff is that in Congress, the staff works all year round. In the state, that might not necessarily be the case. If you're talking about a state legislature that only meets for a certain time a year, obviously during that time when they are in session, the staff will be working full time. They're probably a little more accessible than the federal staff in that when you make a phone call or if you're in person at the state legislature and you go to the individual legislator offices, they're most likely going to be around. Whereas again, because the federal staff work on a number more different issues and scope that they it might not be quite as accessible. But I would also say on the flip side of that after the state legislative calendar or their General Assembly session has ended for the year, many times the offices are not open every day. So a particular staffer might only work a few days a week. Now that doesn't mean that that they're not responsive to concerns, but I would say to try and reach them during the quote-unquote legislative off-season, it might be a little more difficult than mostly year-round when you're contacting a congressional office in Washington or in their district offices.
In terms of the federal legislature, what is the difference between Washington, D.C. and district or state offices?
Sure. So I guess the easiest way to describe it is the Washington-based office does the business of Washington. They are working on those day-to-day issues affecting that are on the floor, the bills and the committee hearings. The local office, the district offices that are in the state, they're much more constituent focused. So if a constituent, say, has a problem with his Social Security benefit, that's where those issues are going to be handled back in the state level with those district workers who are really available to the constituents. It could be immigration issues or Social Security issues, those really individual caseworker kind of issues.
I would also add that it also applies to the legislators' calendar. When they're in Washington, it will be the Washington office that coordinates their schedule in terms of hearings, meetings with other organizations and constituencies, things like that. When Congress is not in session and the legislator goes back to their home district, it's a lot of times the local state offices that coordinate their schedule. They have town hall meetings. They may again meet with constituents and other organizations that are based back in the district as opposed to in Washington. And so it'll really be the state offices that kind of coordinate a lot of those events and meetings when Congress is not in session.
Thank you for joining us for this video supplement to Lesson 1 of iAdvocate on engaging policymakers, the difference between federal and state legislators, and the difference between federal and state legislative authority. Please join us for Lesson 2 of this series on the rules of advocacy.